Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Rebecca Burns, author and journalist based in Georgia. Has written a piece in the American Prospect on the, I don't know, would you call this a burgeoning sort of movement? Or really, in many respects, it's sort of the mutation of climate denialists to a more sort of like practical, we have a problem with this in practice, but in theory, we believe that we need some alternate energy sources. But in practice, this is really problematic, speaking specifically about wind turbines.
Yeah, I'd call this a new phase of the, multi-million-dollar climate denial machine that for years was sort of active in full view, funded by entities like the Koch brothers, to sort of deny and manufacture doubt about the science of climate change. And now that has become, largely undeniable for everyday people who are feeling its effect, has kind of changed tact and is waging a much more under the radar campaign to sort of discredit climate solutions. And what I was looking at particularly is the deployment of renewable energy in the United States.
And we should say, you cite Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Oreskes. I don't pronounce poor names. A book of merchants, I should say, Merchants of Doubt. And we had them on, I guess, when that book came out. Maybe this was about maybe a year ago. I can't remember. But this really does follow the same game plan. They were talking about how within the tobacco business, there was a similar sort of trajectory to this, when did this sort of phase, now that we are sort of in that, it does feel like I guess Donald Trump calls it a hoax. And I should remind people that when he was president, the EPA was not allowed to use the words climate change. That was 4 or 5 years ago. Maybe climate change is been accepted by the Republican Party. I don't think so, but it's not inhibiting their multi-pronged attack. How long has it been that this sort of, I hesitate to call it a movement, but this sort of like tactic has been organized, and where was its first sort of like successful or unsuccessful deployment?
Yeah, well, I think we're certainly seeing what has been sort of a long-standing under the radar movement, in some sense, I would call it. We have very well-funded right-wing think tanks coordinating with sort of conservative activists on the ground in a lot of places. But this has really sort of come to fruition during the Biden administration, because there is a federal push to develop renewable energy, in particular offshore wind, policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. In other words, a federal climate policy that exists, even if it's, by no means adequate. So as we're seeing, some actual real movement on deploying large-scale renewable energy projects, in particular offshore wind, that's when this backlash that's kind of been brewing under the radar is really sort of boiling up sort of into full view and becoming a real problem.
What does that backlash look like? Like, what can they deploy from a propaganda perspective that discredits wind turbines as clean energy? Because what comes to mind, in my opinion, is like maybe appealing to some NIMBY concerns. Not in my backyard. I don't want this kind of monstrosity there. I think they're beautiful, but that's
they kill the birds.
I know, right?
They kill all the birds.
I forgot.
But I mean, we're joking. But
that's what Trump said. Yeah.
Let's start with the NIMBY thing, because I'm with Emma. I see these things and I think they're incredible.
But I will say, I've heard people say, "Oh, like I don't want this built here." I've heard that before, so I would not be shocked if that's what
the eyesore thing in North Dakota gets a lot of play.
Yeah,
right. So I would say, when we hear about sort of community opposition to wind turbines, to solar panels, to offshore wind turbines, It sort of all gets cast as NIMBYism, and I think that's certainly at play here. There are, in particular, for offshore wind, just wealthy homeowners who don't want to see turbines, even if they're going to be 12 miles offshore, have named their groups things like Save Our Beach View. So that's one layer of it. But I think the much more insidious thing at play is sort of the very deliberate deployment of misinformation. You just gave us the impression of Donald Trump talking about wind turbines. But we also have a lot of sort of lower profile operatives and activists who have spread information that offshore wind is responsible for the elevated deaths of whales. Offshore wind that doesn't exist yet, not climate change. That wind turbines have all of these health effects that are either unproven or are known to be false. They'll ruin your town, they'll tank your property values, they'll kill all the birds. And in particularly the mobilizing of environmental concerns, I can give you an example. So we have the Heartland Institute, sort of an infamous right-wing think tank, known for organizing sort of alternative climate change conferences, also known for, opposing federal environmental legislation like the Endangered Species Act, is now just this week filed a lawsuit challenging offshore wind, sort of using the Endangered Species Act, taking up the mantle and trying to say, we're doing this out of conservation concerns. It's woke activists, it's liberals that aren't protecting the whales here.
And it turns out, let's address that specifically, the whales thing. There is zero evidence that wind power deployment is impacting the whales, because these problems with the whales started before any of these deployment of these wind farms, these offshore wind farms, and is far more likely a function of climate change and the change in temperature in the oceans.
Correct. So all of the research scientists I spoke to for this story, because, this claim that offshore wind is killing whales is sort of the most prominent talking point that especially folks on the East Coast, but others are likely to have encountered. So it is true that we've had a couple years of higher than usual numbers of whales washing up on shore. Research scientists, biologists, federal agencies are trying to understand exactly what's going on here. It's likely some combination of threats from the commercial fishing industry, which is also kind of joined in these attacks on renewable energy, and the fact that marine species are having their normal routines, feeding and mating upended by warming ocean water. So the sort of cynical campaign to recast this natural event and just link it to something that in all likelihood is totally unrelated, is something that's actually having a troubling amount of success in a lot of places. So there was polling out of New Jersey that nearly 50% of residents, New Jersey and other states have seen large, wide margins of bipartisan support for renewable energy for many years. But this kind of disinformation campaign is actually measurably eating into that support now. So it's a troubling development.
So in other words, there are actually folks out there who are like, I don't want to kill the whales, even though like my view is not encumbered by these offshore things. I don't want to kill the whales, and so they're not supportive of it. This stuff it's really working.
Yeah, and in some cases, local communities, certainly it's important just for the broader project of, an energy transition in the United States that this have the support of local communities, but also in some cases, zoning permission or approval is needed from local governments in order to move ahead with projects. So there's both sort of a very specific, immediate way that in some cases, local governments, state governments can wield their powers when they're hearing from residents to block these projects. And then also just more broadly, the sense that the climate movement needs these folks on board to move forward and get where we need to be in terms of renewable energy deployment.
When RFK Jr. came out in talking to, I think it was Jordan Peterson, talked about our response to climate change as being authoritarian and whatnot. I went back, and this was, I guess, a couple of months ago, and remembered that when the big wind farm, offshore wind farm was being proposed, somewhere between off the coast, like near Nantucket, off the coast of Massachusetts, off Cape Cod, the Kennedys and RFK Jr. in particular were adamant that this was problematic. They have a compound on the Cape, and I think they do some boating out around there and this and that. That's a prime example, it seems to me, of sort of like hitting sort of both ends of that spectrum. Like you have a NIMBY, but also with some environmental cred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think you're talking about Cape Wind, which was sort of a precursor to what we're seeing now and really sort of provided a model to a lot of the right-wing activists involved in this fight as to how to derail this kind of project. And I want to say certainly there were folks, raising concerns about the siting of that particular project and others, that can be very valid, that there weren't appropriate consultations with tribes, that the exact siting didn't take into effect some valid concerns, but that's not what's being raised, by sort of infamous climate change deniers that sort of flock to fights like these to push a very different message.
What's next in their agenda, or do they need a next, and they're just able to sort of successfully pursue these narratives about the whales or about the birds or about, I guess, are there other sort of things that we should be worrying about? Are we getting like some type of electromagnetic field from the wind that's being generated? And, we're getting brain cancer from the whooshing sound, or what is next on their agenda, or do they need a next?
Yeah, well, I think the troubling thing here is that delay, climate delay is sort of winning for the right. Delaying the action we need, any longer is having catastrophic effects. And also delaying renewable projects, runs up their costs, often screws up their financing, makes it less likely that they're ever going to be built. So the troubling thing is that sort of the playbook that we're seeing deployed, in the case we just mentioned, Cape Wind back in Nantucket more than a decade ago, one of the Koch brothers came out and said towards the end of that fight, my strategy has been delay, delay, delay. I'm going to fight it in court. I'm going to pour money into it. And that's been effective. And that's troubling as we do see, this push to accelerate new wind turbines, new solar panels that we need to probably, triple or quadruple in order to hit the Biden administration's goal for the power sector, which is to have it, running on renewables by 2035. Every sort of little delay adds up to a much bigger problem.
Indeed. Rebecca Burns, author, journalist based in Georgia, writing in the American Prospect against the wind. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.